Hello everyone, and welcome to the Digital Education series. And this particular edition, which I think is of fundamental importance to all of us, is on academic freedom in the digitized world. This is the Digital Education series is a partnership between the Centre for Distance Education based in the University of London in London and the University of London Institute in Paris, where I'm based. What I'm going to do is introduce the session to you, introduce the panelists, and then I'm going to hand over to the panel to give some introductory thoughts around the subject. Then we're going to have a bit of a discussion, and then we'll invite questions from the floor. So I do hope that you'll get your creative thinking going and have some good questions for us towards the end of the session. So we're going to explore really the concept of academic freedom and how this is being influenced by the world we live in at the moment. Clearly, academic freedom is of fundamental importance in higher education and something that we should be always thinking about and always struggling to maintain and further, I think. And as all of you will appreciate, and I think we've got a global audience with us this afternoon, the way that academic freedom is understood, its values, the behaviors that underpin it, is probably different in many different parts of the world, in different nations, in different cultural situations. But that's, again, part of the discussion that we'll be having. But also, how much has the digital world, which of course crosses borders much more easily than us physical beings at the moment, how much is that influencing it? And that's one of the things that we're going to talk about today. I've got a really super panel with me today, colleagues that I've known over a number of years. And I'd like to tell you a little bit about the panel, and then I'll introduce you one by one to you. So I'll start off in the running order. So we have with us Dr. David Baum, who's an independent international higher education researcher. He's an evaluator, consultant, and a staff and educational developer and writer, and also a fellow of the Centre for Distance Education. I have my colleague here in Paris, Dr. Edouard Morina, who's a lecturer in French Studies and International Politics at the University of London Institute in Paris. And then we'll move over to Dr. Claire Sampson, also a CDE fellow, who is an independent scholar who combines teaching postgraduate biomedical sciences with a particular emphasis on distance education with science writing and education and editing. And then we're going to finish up with my colleague, Professor Jeremy Carrott from the University of Kent, who is Dean for Europe and Professor of Philosophy, Religion and Culture. So I'm now going to hand over to David, who's going to talk to us for 6 or 7 minutes about fundamental rights and obligations. David, over to you.
Tim, Chair, thank you very much indeed. Academic freedom in a digitized world. I'm going to offer you 5 propositions and explore briefly some of the implications of these 5 propositions. Proposition 1, academic freedom. The freedom to think, to say, to write, more broadly to express, is an essential set of rights if a university is to achieve its missions. I take those missions to include advancing and sharing knowledge and understanding, and also advancing and sharing capabilities, values, whatever else we think a university should be advancing and sharing, all with the ultimate goal of helping the world become a better place. We should do this within the law, which doesn't preclude us from seeking to change the law by legal means. Technology can greatly speed this free expression for better and for worse. The opposite, or at any rate an opponent of freedom of expression, is of course censorship. Censorship results in unexpressed thoughts, which feels like a waste. So that was proposition 1, academic freedom as a right. Proposition 2, academic freedom includes not just freedom to express our own views, but also freedom critically to review the work of ourselves and of others within the law. Whether we take a dialectical approach, considering thesis, antithesis, synthesis, or a Popperian approach with recurring cycles of conjectures and refutations, or any number of other approaches, the relationship between creation and critique is often central. This interaction can live in conversations, which are an essential part of university process, again with the intent to help make the world a better place. These conversations can take place over timescales from seconds to centuries. Again, technology makes faster responses possible, although the speed of the response doesn't always assure either the wisdom or the appropriateness of the response, to put it mildly. Censorship would also result in uncritiqued thoughts, which feels to me to be downright dangerous. That was my proposition 2. Academic freedom includes the freedom to critique, as well as to express our own ideas. Proposition 3, freedom to express and freedom to critique are not just essential rights. I've recently, probably belatedly, come to think that they are also obligations. Why do I think this? Well, what happens if we don't develop and create and express new ideas? And if we don't critique our own and others' new ideas? If we don't continue to do these things, then again, the university will not, or only much less effectively, achieve its missions as previously suggested, and thereby do a much less good of helping to make the world a better place within the law and through thoughtful use of technology. So these are not just rights, they're obligations. Academic freedom is not just a right, it's also an obligation. To be clear, it's an obligation on us. Proposition 4, in discharging our rights and obligations to think and express freely and critically, there are still obligations on us, not so much on what we say, but rather, I think, on how we say it. First of all, when exercising our right and obligation to freedom of expression, we have to show our working. We need to explain why we are saying and proposing what we are saying and proposing. Freedom of expression does not usefully include the freedom to engage in reasonless ranting. As we express and as we critique, we should be courteous, not denying our passions, but not confusing passion with rational argument, not committing what we might call the neo-Cartesian error, quote, I feel this strongly, therefore I am right about it, close quote. That really does not follow. Proposition 4 then, we should practice our freedom of expression rationally and courteously. Finally, proposition 5, something surprising followed for me from these previous 4 propositions. Here it is. I don't think that universities can be safe places. They must be physically safe, of course, but not, I think, intellectually safe. And because information and ideas promote emotional as well as intellectual responses, I think universities cannot be emotionally safe either. What to do? How can we reconcile this tension between freedom and safety? Well, I don't think we can, not entirely. There are things we can do. We can put a sign on the front door saying something such as dangerous ideas roam freely here. We should give everybody who wants to join us fair warning. We can, we should, we must ensure support for everyone in the institution who may need it when difficult, threatening ideas unsettle them. Them, of course, includes us. Expert professional support, peer support, community support, both first aid and longer term, as we each undertake our exciting, important, difficult, challenging academic quests. Or maybe the sign over the door should simply read, you may change your mind. Some such message captures the possibilities, the excitement, the individual responsibility, and also the fear, all of which are inevitably involved in committing to higher education, certainly in any academic role. The technologies exist. It's partly up to us which technologies we select and then how we use them. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David. I think that provides a very thought-provoking and substantial basis for the conversation we're going to have. I really appreciate that. So I'm now going to pass over to my colleague Edouard and ask him to talk a little bit about academic freedom in the context of his specialist area, which is social effects of social impact of measures against climate change, I think. Have I got that right, Edouard? You can correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So, I mean, I'm going to basically draw on my own kind of personal experience and my own area of research. So my research focuses on climate politics. And I guess my minor contribution to this discussion is really to kind of focus on how this kind of issue of academic freedom plays out in the climate debate, in the academic climate debate more specifically. I guess the first point I'd like to make is that when we look at this contemporary debates on climate change in academia, it's actually quite interesting to see that those who refer the most to academic freedom are actually people who criticize or who challenge or who deny the climate science. So what we're seeing at the moment is kind of a weaponization by climate skeptics or climate denialists of academic freedom. And so it's really, they are the ones who, invoke this notion of academic freedom, arguing that, their perspectives are not heard, that they are unable to express their views, to criticize, dominant perspectives or dominant understandings of the climate science within the university space and within society and the media more generally. And I find that quite interesting because I feel it does raise kind of a number of important questions. In particular, and I guess bouncing off of what has just been said, to what extent should these perspectives or do these perspectives have a place within academia? And as I say, I think it is an important question, but also what I feel it also more generally points to the kind of highly political nature of academic research relating to climate change. And this applies both to the hard sciences and to the social sciences. And so effectively, I think I wouldn't say it's specific to the climate agenda, but climate science and climate scientists do occupy a central place within contemporary policy debates on climate change. If you look at some of the discourses and policy discourses or discourses by politicians, they tend to refer to this idea of following this, we need to follow the science. We need to adopt a science-first approach. We need to adopt a science-driven agenda. So there's this kind of idea that policy responses to the climate crisis are effectively translations of science into policy, into action. And so effectively, that means that when you work on climate change, if you are a climate scientist or if you are even a social scientist such as myself working on climate change, you are inevitably kind of drawn into this kind of broader political arena. And that, I think, also raises a number of questions in relation to this issue of academic freedom. And I would say that the main outcome of this as well is that it tends to also reinforce quite a binary approach to climate action. I mean, when you look at the climate debate and how it's framed, it tends to be one that is framed as an opposition or as an opposition between those who believe the science and those who don't, those who are for climate action and those who oppose it, between truth and disinformation. And so as a result, there's this kind of blurring of the distinction between what is science, the science of climate change, and also climate policy. And so effectively, for or against the climate science turns into for or against a particular approach to addressing the climate problem. And so I would say that this indirectly also contributes to reinforce a one-size-fits-all approach to addressing the climate issue. And if we look at contemporary debates on climate change, again, it tends to reinforce market-based solutions. It tends to reinforce bottom-up voluntary efforts, which are presented as logical translations of the climate science into policy. And so as a result, and I think this kind of binary approach, what we see is that we also see, paradoxically, not just a marginalization of critical voices of science of climate change, but we also see, to a certain extent, a marginalizations of critical voices against the kind of dominant approach towards climate policy. Because the two, as I say, climate science and climate policy tend to be combined and mixed, jumbled together. And so, and I'll conclude with this, I mean, I think this poses a fundamental challenge for academics working on climate change, and in particular for social scientists working on climate change, because it does tend to restrict the possibility of informed contradiction, again, not necessarily, not specifically on the science, but on the policy. And this, I guess, is something that I am faced with as well, working on policy solutions to climate change. What I find is that in the name of science, in the name of translating science into policy, alternative perspectives or different views on what needs to be done are sometimes marginalized. And you could argue to a certain extent that this does also pose a challenge in terms of this kind of broader question of academic freedom. And I'll stop there.
Edouard, thank you very much for that. That was really fascinating, and I very much I'm attracted to the concept of how weaponization of freedom, and also the sort of the resultant marginalization of critical voices works out in and it's really interesting to contextualize this in an area that's been so heated. It's been slightly overtaken by discussions of pandemic recently, but it's clearly a topic that engenders a lot of heat, and maybe that's the wrong metaphor to use in this particular case, but it does philosophically, it does in terms of critical debate. So thank you very much for that. We're now going to carry on in the sort of science theme, moving over to Claire, who's works particularly in biomedical sciences, as well as her many other areas of influence that she works on. And Claire, I'd like to hand over to you, please.
Well, thank you very much, Tim, and for allowing me to join this distinguished panel. I must start by saying that, yes, I am, as Tim has said, a hard scientist. So you might say that I'm slightly sort of out of my sphere in this type of discussion. However, therefore, what I really want to do is to pose a series of questions that I hope that we can discuss later on. I'll start, as the last speaker was discussing climate, with a thought experiment. Imagine that you in your university contexts have been approached by the leader of a student group about the idea of inviting Piers Corbyn to address a meeting. If you're out of the sort of UK sort of scene and don't know this particular gentleman, he's a well-known conspiracy theorist and climate change denialist, anti-vaxxer and the like, as well as being the older brother of our last leader of the opposition. Do you, as I do, instantly recoil and try and think of any possible way of banning Piers? Well, if you do, think about his younger brother Jeremy, aforementioned former leader of the Labour Party, well known for his views that some people might describe as far left. If you recoil at the idea of students inviting Piers, you may very well applaud them inviting Jeremy, unless, of course, you're also Jewish. The point is that promoting free speech, as David in particular did so eloquently just now, is only straightforward for any of us until or unless you come across ideas that simply repel you. I would argue that even the most ardent free speech advocates will have a line that they draw in the sand. They may not be aware of them, but there will be one. Should a apparently reformed Islamic terrorist or an extreme anti-abortion advocate be allowed as to speak to a group of students? What has changed with digitisation is, of course, the size and nature of that audience. We're no longer talking about students or anyone else inviting people with extreme views to speak. We're in a marketplace where extremists and others have huge megaphones. The ideal presented by David of the freedom to explore dangerous ideas in a rational and, as far as possible, in a safe way, has broken out of its ivory tower. And this is much, can seem to be much to its detriment. The Twitterverse has become an area where there is a megaphone for ideas that many people think are not so much radical as plain stupid. And one of the questions that I'd like to pose to this audience for discussion is, what does an audience of free thinking academics and scientists in all disciplines think of whether Trump, with his X, and I can't remember what X was, million previous Twitter followers, have been banned? Of course, in any society, we're affected by what's called, and I'm sure that many of you who are social scientists will be much more familiar with this than me, the Overton window of discourse, the range of views that mainstream media is prepared to accept. Think of any sort of series of points of view, if you like, from more freedom of expression to less freedom, and there is always going to be sort of points of view that are considered by the mainstream in order from right to left or whatever it is, from unthinkable through radical, acceptable to sensible to policy, and then out the other way. We hear a lot, at least I do, about the idea of the Overton window having moved to the right in recent years, and the role that social media, Twitter and others, have played in that. And I'm sure that if, and Eduardo's topic may have something to say about this, there are such things as PhD students and PhD theses in the 23rd century, then I'm sure that there will be plenty of such theses written about the idea of the relationships between the social media and the growth of right-wing discourse. But there's also a fracturing into often hostile mindsets. In the infamous Brexit debate, it's easy for people like me, and you can take that however you like, to forget that you don't change people's minds by calling them an idiots. It's not so much what we say as how we say it. So how should we as academics respond to the fractioning and coarsening of the social media discourse? I'm deliberately not recommending one social media site above another. I've talked about Twitter, but that's really from my own experience. Yes, good point, David. We should allow anyone to speak, but require that every speaker is challenged. Yes, that is definitely a good way of looking at things. I would suggest that we must remain open to what David described as dangerous ideas, but we must do so in a way that is sensitive to others' points of view. Rarely, whatever we think of those others and those points of view, and that we should consider the idea of trigger warnings. And that's where I'd like to leave it. So thank you very much.
Claire, thank you very much for that. Extremely thought-provoking. And yeah, I think we'll all agree that the Twitterverse is not particularly etymologically robust at the moment, but we'll see whether we can build that or not. I think it's really, really useful to personalize the concept in the way that you did, and to talk about, the lines that we all draw in the sand, and whether we're aware of these lines or not, and how far we're prepared to go into the danger zones. And now I think all of our speakers have mentioned these uncomfortable, these zones of discomfort, these zones of danger, these zones of threat, if you like, and what they mean to us, and how we can enter that territory and remain sensitive, receptive, understanding, empathetic human beings. It's tricky. And certainly I don't think we've given ourselves an easy subject of debate today. So I very much appreciate the views so far. And I always look to philosophy to solve all the world's problems. And so I'm relying on my friend Jeremy to dig us out of this hole and give us a philosophical view on this subject that will help to take us through the debate. Jeremy, no challenge here.
Thank you, Tim. I'm not sure that solving, but raising more questions. That's my hope, anyway. Thank you. I think what I want to do is to raise some questions and to try and iron out some of the confusions which I see exist within the debate about the ideal of free speech. Because we talk about freedom without asking what constitutes freedom. And this problem is intensified, particularly in relation to freedom in the digital world. And so what I want to do is to kind of outline a position of freedom as a condition of interdependence within lived contexts, which I think rests at the base of those great icons of free speech, John Locke's toleration freedom and John Stuart Mill's concern with the tyranny of the majority against the individual. So there are differences in our understanding of freedom. And there are differences in political and legal freedom, academic freedom, and also digital freedoms in their specific contexts. Now, in order to get beneath these kinds of questions, what I want to do is to pose three philosophical concerns around the issue of freedom. So my first question is to ask, what is free in the act of free speech? And following on from this, I want to ask, when we understand that, how free is the digital? And finally, and I think that the previous speakers are touching on this central point, what is the relationship between free speech and truth? So to the first question, what is free about the act of free speech? I think in thinking about the conditions of freedom, we need to ask about whether saying anything is actually an act of freedom. Hence, the Mahayana Buddhist concept that be not like the bird that flies across the ocean, because your freedom could become your prison. Freedom holds a point of relational orientation. It can easily function as an abstract ideal, even though it does work as a political currency in many of our institutions. But the problem here is whether the discussion of freedom rightly assumes autonomous agents speaking out about anything without understanding the speech act in a particular context. Does speech ever operate without a relational choice implicit within freedom? Or more sharply, does freedom hold aspects of constraint? For example, we might question whether only real freedom, total unrestriction, actually takes place within our private thoughts, not within our speech. Because speech with others is situated in dialogue and interaction, but our thoughts are private spaces and can entertain anything without limiting or damaging or causing offense to others. Though those of you who are psychoanalysts might unpick that to say that we don't choose our own thoughts and that our thoughts come from other regions and may be unwanted, i.e. unconscious free associations. So I may be inhibiting my own sense of self in my own thought. But the point I want to make here is that if we were in the middle of an isolated forest, I could actually say anything I wished without, assuming the trees don't understand my language, offending another. But speech with another is distinct. It has a relational quality. So the point I'm making is that speech is fundamentally relational, and free speech is a question of that relationality. There is no effective speech in isolation. It is what it does that is important. Therefore, the question of rights and responsibilities that have come up in the discussion far are important, but they're always implicated by this relational concern, courteousness, sensitivity. There is always in free speech a question of the other, and therefore the ideal of free speech is itself problematic. I cannot have free speech in isolation or ignore that potentially my speech affects others. Relations create freedoms. If I'm right in saying that freedom is a relation of speech that needs a dialogue, this means that free speech should be returned in a different form as free discussion. In the university context, this is important because reckless free speech is not questioned, as has been pointed out. We need it to be examined. Therefore, free speech in the university requires a particular inquiry. Freedom, therefore, is not a thing, but a process and something that we recognize in actions. So this takes us to the question of the digital. So if I'm taking this idea of relationality and freedom as central, the digital space alters my act of free speech because it changes the nature of the relational moment, because the platform of the digital is determined and structured by particular interests. It takes us back to the question of freedom and determinism. It was Marx who pointed out that individual freedom is conditioned by property, ownership, and wealth, i.e. the owners of power and the means of production. In this case, the tech giants, Google, Facebook, Instagram, etc. So the digital is determined by particular interests and powers. It's also determined by gender, race, orientation, and these are not equal and thus not free, because speech is restrained by these groups, as is well articulated by the post-colonial thinker Rupika Ripsam in her Post-Colonial Digital Humanities, where she indicates that the global South has a very different relationship to the digital. The digital therefore raises questions about the apparatus, access, the nature of analytics, and authority. Can I be free if algorithms are determining my choices? Back to Claire's point about the Brexit. Cambridge Analytica have involvement in the Vote Leave campaign. Big data determines and limits our freedom. But at a deeper dimension, the quality of the interrelational freedom is at stake when the nature of my self-formation is changed by the digital itself. If you prefer, the limitation of relationality is created by the digital. So in the attention economy of the digital age, or attention capitalism, as I prefer to call it, sensation, shock, hate, emotive comments gain clicks. Nuance doesn't gain access. So inside this, there is a digital formation of selfhood that cuts the relational form, removes the sense of the other, creates a vacuum of speech, and where the embodied reality is undermined. The digital creates echo chambers which reinforce false sense of self. And finally, all of this implicates us in the question of truth. Fake news in the digital unreality rests on a particular way that speech is constructed. And we need to therefore question of whether we are free if truth is distorted and how truth is compromised. In summary, the digital age makes truth precarious, and therefore the question of freedom is fundamentally undermined. Thank you.
Jeremy, thank you very much for that. That was great, and really, I think, takes on the discussion to a level that's a really interesting one, and it puts in focus quite a few dichotomies. I think there's a dichotomy between the sort of emotional responses that we have and the way that is through the echo chambers. You mentioned the echo chambers of social media and so on, how that's amplified, and the sort of rationality that we would be encouraged to think about if we were thinking in a sort of purely epistemological way about how we construct reality, how we evidence reality, and how we discuss and critique reality. And I wonder if that might be a starting point for some comments generally from the panel about how this is playing out in the digital world at the moment, and how much is the critical inquiry that's informed by the sort of epistemological approaches that David was talking about right at the beginning, of inquiry, of critique, of whether it be Popperian approaches or others. How is that played out, and how does it keep butting up against the sort of emotive responses that we find in any of the issues, be it climate change, be it the pandemic, be it vaccinations, be it any of the emotive issues that we're facing in our day and age? So would anyone in the panel like to take that on and talk a little bit about those, the conflict of those concepts?
I'm thinking much harder about the implications of the tech now. I think the comments about algorithms, the comments about the way about what sells and what doesn't, about what grabs our attention and doesn't, which Jeremy made in particular, are profoundly important. I'm trying not to be profoundly depressed by them. But it does make me want to hang out for the old-fashioned, boring-sounding courtesies of being nice and being polite to each other, not loving each other, but being courteous to each other, because they seem to me to be fundamental to the success of the whole academic enterprise, which does require civilized, rational debate rather than just ranting, shouting, and fighting. So I'm hearing an objective defense. I'm hearing a rationale based on what we want universities to achieve for old-fashioned virtues of courtesy arising from. So it's not just that I feel more comfortable being courteous. I think I have rational reasons now. So it's always nice when your prejudices get intellectual confirmation. So I thank Jeremy for that.
Can I ask Edward to talk a little bit about how that might play out in your area, the politics of climate change, because I think that's an area where all of these issues are very much at the forefront.
Yeah, I mean, thanks. I mean, I really enjoyed the other speakers' interventions, but I guess on the issue of emotion, I guess maybe that's where I feel, I mean, you mentioned emotive responses, and you mentioned kind of social media and kind of online kind of tools as being more prone to kind of emotive responses rather than informed kind of discussion and interactions. I mean, I guess that's clearly something that I find is quite relevant in the case of climate change. And I guess it's even more relevant in the sense that a big part of the, I guess, kind of dominant kind of discourses around climate action are also centered on emotions. So it's kind of focusing on fear, focusing on hope, and hoping that will kind of generate, generate action. And so when it comes to academic kind of interactions and the role of academics within those kind of virtual spaces, I'm thinking in particular within social media, where they're constantly, I mean, I have a Twitter account because actually it's also a really important kind of source of interaction and exchanges for me. But it is kind of sometimes very difficult to distinguish between, what is emotion and also how such an emotional topic such as climate change is, I mean, yeah, what is emotion and what is kind of rational or reasoned kind of discussion. And as I said, it's actually something that I think academics working on climate change are actually struggling with as well to a certain extent, because I think when, from the moment that you take an interest in this topic and you work on this topic, it does become, you do also kind of fall into the emergency of the situation. You do also fall into the emotion to a certain extent, and it does make it even difficult for me sometimes to, maintain, well, to keep my kind of academic cap on, or to try and kind of stick to, some of the unwritten rules of academic engagement as well, because I also want things to move. I also want the problem to be addressed, and I'm also in a way sucked into this urgency and sucked into the broader topic. And I would say that, yeah, the digital world for that is not very useful, because I think when I stick to kind of more conventional forms of engagement, academic engagement, when I write a journal article, for instance, you still have the peer review process. You still have these kind of processes in place that I think kind of guarantee a certain form of kind of informed engagement with the topic, which you don't have at all, I think, on online, in social media in particular.
Thank you. That's very eloquently put, and I like the sort of the carrot and the stick of the hope and fear that can lead to action and therefore are used with great abandon. Claire, how does this play out in the world, in your world? How do you see that?
Now that is actually, in some ways, if you're asking me to address my professional environment, then in some ways the biomedical sciences are more factual and sort of less emotive than some other issues, though the whole sort of vax and anti-vax argument that's come up. And what I would say is that one extraordinary thing and almost silver lining that I've found from the pandemic at a personal level is just how interesting everyone now suddenly finds the subject that I've been teaching and I've been banging on about for over 20 years. Being able to talk to anyone, including the person serving me in Tesco, about how vaccines work, is in a way a privilege, and one that is clearly sort of amplified by such social media sort of platforms as I have, which isn't great, I have to say.
Can I ask you, Claire, to what extent is the existence of this very strong anti-vax movement a failure of science to explain itself, and to what extent is it something else?
Gosh, well, there have always been anti-vaxxers. If you go back to the introduction of the cowpox vaccine against smallpox by Jenner, there are famous paintings, contemporary paintings of showing cows growing out of people's arms. So it is not a new problem at all. And why vaccination in particular? I mean, there are not, okay, there are people who are against drug treatment of illness, why vaccines in particular have elicited this extraordinary emotional response is something that I, if you'd asked me the question several weeks ago, I could have looked into the literature, but I can't guess at an answer now.
It seems to me that both you and Edouard were saying something very similar in the sense that there's a great range of discussion around subjects of great importance and great range of people who support a particular proposition and who are against a particular proposition. But in some way, and perhaps this, and I'd be interested to hear if you think this is a phenomenon of the digital age, but this debate is becoming increasingly polarized, and you get pushed into a black-white, a yes-no, a very polarized dichotomy. In fact, in both debates, in the pandemic, in the anti-vax movement, in the climate change, and therefore that's as I think as many of you have said, it is a threat to really exploring what freedom of discussion around these issues means, because Edouard referred to this earlier on. There is a marginalization because of sort of weaponization, because of political views, because of emotive issues, of ideas that need to be heard, possibly. Does anyone want to react to that?
If I can come in, Tim, I think what I liked about Edouard's point was around this weaponization of freedom. The very fact that freedom can be weaponized ultimately opens up the fundamental contradiction of what freedom is as an ideal state could be. And I think that the long traditions of academic practice are undermined in digital forms, and that we need to recognize that there is an academic training which over many years has established ways of verifying truth, testing truth, thinking through questions. That's why we have disciplines in the strictest sense, the disciplines of various forms of knowledge. So the ways that we understand, the ways that we debate. And I think that truth within the community of academia has procedures which safeguard the exploration of truth. But when you put those questions into a public space, which is unregulated, then the very foundations of that academic practice become undermined. And I think that's where the digital challenges fundamental rules of academic practice. And we see that in the debates that Claire and Edouard are putting forward. So the digital is making us enter into a more complicated space of knowledge verification.
And surely what we're talking about by academic practice is epistemology. It's the approach to building knowledge and sharing knowledge, which you could argue isn't restricted to academic circles. That all of us have basic epistemological approaches that we all use, but these may or may not serve us as best they could, depending on, I suppose, how well honed they are as a craft, I guess. Interesting. Would anyone else like to chip in on this?
Yes, if I may, I'd like to say that one sort of reason for this is surely the fact that the debates that have been in sort of closed and possibly sanitized academic spheres, the famous ivory towers, in the digital world they cannot. Everything it is almost impossible to sort of discuss ideas in a digital format, except in an essentially open marketplace, which means that we're opening them up to people who haven't been trained to think. Yes, and there have been some very interesting comments, both about science education and about sort of early education, the idea of training people to think in, well, introducing people to critical thinking even in fairly early education. I mean, and if you don't mind reference to Dickens, if only our own education was less grind-esque.
Yeah.
I see some nods from people who have also read Hard Times.
And also think, one of the training to think is a really interesting concept, and how much is it a part of the curriculum in everyday school life that we all encounter in different parts of the world? Good question. It's made explicit sometimes in curricula. If you think of the International Baccalaureate, there's the theory of knowledge, which is very explicitly aimed at that sort of training to think, the exploration of epistemological approaches. So it's, prepares students particularly well for university in that respect. But is it present in education generally? Is it present in primary education, for example, and that's interesting. But that's one way of putting it. But the other way, a slightly more cynical view might be that people know perfectly well how they should be logically evaluating issues, but the weaponization that Edouard referred to is all about knowing how the emotions can cloud other thought out judgments or nuanced points of view. And I think that's perhaps part of the interesting effect of the digital.
Yeah, I agree with that, Tim. So to put in there, but I do think that the platform itself is designed in an economy of attention, which cannot therefore evaluate knowledge in the same way, because it's looking for the sensation, and that's where we need to be critical of the mechanism itself. Interesting.
So, I mean, that's an interesting jumping off point, because we've got about 5 minutes left, and I'd like to hear from each of you what you think could be done to improve the prospects of freedom of speech in the digital age. What could be done? Do we need a new social media platform? Do we need something else? Do we need to burn it all down and start again? Well, what can we do? Shall I go in the order of appearance? So David, put you on the spot. What can we do?
The first thing we can do is behave well. And have the conversations about what it means to behave well. It's so easy to get dragged into doing things which we know will attract attention by whatever means work. I think we should resist that temptation. I think we should behave well and justify our account of what well means. Thoughtful, respectful, to disentangle the problem we got into the word criticism, which has a very good academic meaning, which is to interrogate, to question, and the general public use of the word critical, which is just, I'll use the vernacular, forgive me, to slag off, to be unintelligently rude about. I think we may need another word for critical, but that's a slightly bigger quest than we can achieve today.
Thanks for that. I'll get on to the wordsmiths. Edouard.
So that's a big question, and I'm probably not the best person to answer that. But I mean, I think, referring back to Jeremy's points, I think there's obviously an element. I think regulate, in particular, the big tech companies, and try to kind of find ways of ensuring that at least these platforms are more transparent and function possibly differently. But at the same time, I think what we can do already, and I think it's an increasing, I think, part of also our work as academics, as lecturers and as teachers in a way, is also to learn and to engage with our students and get them to also be aware of what lies behind these platforms and how to also engage with them cautiously and in a way that is informed and also possibly, and I think that's something that I'm personally struggling with as well with some students, is get them to re-engage with material that existed before the digital age, such as books and academic journal articles. It's a challenge, but I think there's still, and I think it's important to highlight how important and relevant they continue to be, and possibly even more relevant today in a digital world.
Excellent. Thanks, Edouard. Claire, over to you.
Gosh, well, in being put on the spot like
Indeed.
this, I think that, well, I'd like to echo again something that David has raised, the points about courtesy and the old phrase, never judge someone until you've walked a mile in their moccasins. And the difference between the vital importance of critiquing ideas and the danger in critiquing individuals as individuals, trying to take the personal out of the criticism, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that does make sense. Thank you. Yeah, and Jeremy, a last word on the subject from you.
Well, I think one of the things we need to do is have debates like this, ultimately to raise the critical questions of the age that we're living within. And I think the other important aspect is to recognize that we live in communities which are not digital but are embodied, and that our wider community offline is as important as our community online. I think we've learned that through the pandemic, and ultimately the importance of switching off the machine.
Indeed, switching off the machine, which we're going to have to do in a minute. So David, Edouard, Claire, Jeremy, thank you very much. I think it's been a great session, really thought-provoking. I've enjoyed it a lot, and I'm sure the audience have enjoyed your contributions and the debate that we've had. This has been recorded, and we'll be writing up some notes from it, which we'll put out as a report, and we'll make the video available on the usual site. I think it'll be based on the Centre for Distance Education site, and we look forward to continuing the debate, and we look forward to behaving well in a courteous fashion, and getting the social media giants to account for themselves a little bit more. And thank you very much for this debate, and really appreciate it. And thank you to all of those behind the scenes who've been working on this as well. Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone.